I'm Kareem, your host at the One Soccer Nation podcast, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Earl Cochrane. Earl is the founder and CEO at Kinova Solutions. Earl, thank you so much for taking the time today. How's it going?
It's my pleasure. It's going well.
Nice. So I've known you for a few years now as a fellow Canadian. I've seen you on LinkedIn, but this is our our second time actually connecting online. So it's a pleasure to connect with such a seasoned person in the beautiful game. But can you just take us back in time and share how you got involved in the beautiful game?
Sure. And I'll take seasoned kind of means old sometimes, doesn't it?
You got a few. You got a few decades.
Yeah. Yeah, I think as I said to you before, I've been a fan of what you're doing. I've watched a couple of your podcasts, so when you reached out, I said, yeah, I'd be happy to do it. My history in this game is, 50 years long, right? I grew up in Scarborough, one of two boys with a single mother, raising two boys, two energetic, athletic boys. And I can remember my first kind of introduction to the sport was wanting to kind of be around some of the friends that I grew up with, right? And, finding the club locally that they all participated in. It was probably around, grade 3, grade 4, when I started playing. And I played with that club for, the better part of 15, 16 years. There's guys that I grew up with in the south end of Scarborough that I still am in contact today. We've got a WhatsApp group of, 40, 50 guys, and all of their relatives that we keep in touch with. I have dinner pretty regularly with guys that I played with, as a toddler and a young teen. And so that connection to the sport has always sort of been there for me. I went to school here locally in Ontario. I went to Carleton University, played there. And it was at a strange time in the evolution of our sport, I think, where the NASL had gone away. The CPL at the time was sort of on its last legs. There was a team in Ottawa when I went to school there, but they had just folded shortly after. And there weren't really many opportunities in North America to participate. And so I always had this feeling that I could play professionally at some point, and I can remember making a decision at the end of school or at the end of my undergraduate degree, whether I go and take a shot and see whether I could make something of this sport, or and I can remember when the application or when the letter came in from the University of Toronto saying I got accepted to a master's program, whether I took that for sure thing. And I took the for sure thing, went to school, but I always had this sort of inkling that I could probably play somewhere. And I can remember when I defended my thesis, I think it was maybe the next day I jumped on a plane and headed to Asia. And I sort of picked Asia as a little bit of a fallback. If it didn't work out, here I was in Southeast Asia. I had an opportunity to kind of bomb around for a little while and enjoy myself, and then come back and enter the real world. But as it turned out, I was successful and, made the team in Penang, played a couple seasons, and then made my way from Malaysia to Japan, lived in Japan for a handful of years. And then ultimately I was entrenched in the sport, made my way back to North America and ended up at BC. So, it's in a similar way, my path and career path into the sport was, not very linear, if that makes sense, in a similar way that, players develop, referees develop, it's, the development of your career path ends up being kind of windy and bumpy. But I ended up in the sport pretty full time in the late part of the 90s, in a wonderful place in Washington, and haven't looked back.
Amazing. You mentioned Scarborough, Ontario. That's in Canada for our overseas listeners. With saying that, transitioning from a playing career to a front office career is not an easy transition. What advice could you give to listeners that are currently playing that want to transition into the front office in the future?
Um, I mean, I think be open to different things and different opportunities. Um, it's not really any different from most career paths in any industry, right? You get into an organization, you learn, you absorb things like a sponge, and you take risks, right? Be not to be afraid of taking some risky challenges, and in some cases taking yourself outside of your comfort zone, to stretch yourself as an individual. And then that would be my key advice is to take the opportunities when they come, even if they seem as though they may be risky at the time, but welcome them, embrace them, and learn from them.
Absolutely. Your career spans from various roles, from CEO at Kinova Solutions to serving on the boards of FIFA, CONCACAF, and when I hear those names, I get excited. How has this diverse experience shaped your approach to sports leadership?
Um, for me, it all comes back to people in the end, right? I think it's and it goes back to when I was playing it. The bonds that you create, the friendships that you have, the ability to learn, um, from the various people, from the diverse groups that you surround yourself with. Um, and when I say diverse, I mean the multiplicity of diversity, right? Diverse thought. Um, People come from diverse backgrounds and cultures, uh, diverse socioeconomic pasts. Um, and so my travels and my involvement in the sport over the last sort of 25, 30 years has allowed me to have conversations and meet people that have challenged in some ways my thinking, and that's all been positive. Whether it's been Southeast Asia, whether it's been in America, here in Canada, or the diverse cultures that you bounce up against every once in a while, when you're involved in the sport as for as long as I have been. um, you have to take those learnings and learn from the diversity of the group that you surrounded yourself with.
You mentioned being challenged, your thinking being challenged. What has been one of the biggest challenges that you faced in regards to questioning that you went, wow, I really need to think about this one?
It's a tough question. I think when you are involved in a sport that as significant as maybe ours is, and you come from a country like Canada, who isn't a traditional power in the sport, right? And you sometimes may question the validity of the strength of your thought, and maybe your opinions and how they influence. But I've found, as you have conversations with people around the world, and in some cases in traditional powerhouse countries like Germany, the UK, Portugal, Brazil, all of those people in the sport are willing to listen and learn from everybody else, and the ideas and concepts that you may have, they're willing to listen to, and they're willing to invite that different approach to things. So having those conversations is an important starting point. Um, Even though you feel as though uh, you may not have a place in that conversation, I think it's important to have those conversations.
Mhm. That having conversations like that are not always easy, especially when you feel that way. But very true. As the CEO of Kinova Solutions, you focus on corporate and global affairs, crisis management, and sport diplomacy, if I'm saying that correctly. Can you share a specific instance where these skills were crucial in navigating in challenging situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, risk management and crisis management, and they're not about avoiding risk or not about avoiding. Some of those things are inevitable. It's about preparing yourself for it. And in some ways, sport diplomacy is sort of a concept that's relatively new. The America, I think it's the State Department in the U.S. have a department solely focused on sport diplomacy. Other governments do the same. The concept of using sport to bring people and countries and communities kind of together through that shared love of you know the physical sport, and in some cases using that connection to implement policy and objectives of what your country ultimately looks to do, or what your organization looks to do. And I think where I really got a quick glance of what it was about was really in Qatar and in Doha. And Qatar had sort of a 12-year window to build toward a World Cup in 2022, and there were a lot of questions about the significance of hosting a World Cup in the Middle East, hosting it in at the time it was being hosted, and a lot of questions, most of which revolved around a term that gets used quite often, sport washing. And I think there's a balance and a fine line to walk between sport diplomacy and sport washing. There's a professor, much smarter mind than me in this space, Dr. Lindsay Krasnoff. I think she's based out of New York, who's very, very bright and talks about this more eloquently than I could, with a focus perhaps on basketball. But when I look at Qatar's situation and the build up toward the World Cup, what was lost on many people was the significant shift in policy, the significant approach to what they were looking to do, that was ultimately affected by hosting the tournament and affected by sport itself. Did it go fast enough for some people? Did it go deep enough for some people? Perhaps not. But it shouldn't be lost that it did have an impact. And I think that impact that sport had on domestic policy, on the approach to certain aspects, I think was incredibly important at the time. And it's going to continue to be. The host of the World Cup in 2034 is likely to be the Saudis. But it doesn't really matter where these massive events are. The ability for the sport themselves to drive significant change, I think, is significant. And that's ultimately something that I'm looking to do.
Absolutely, so much power in soccer. It's the most watched sport in the world. I don't remember the numbers correctly. I think is it 8 billion, 3 billion, or 8 billion people that 3
It's
billion?
significant. I mean, the numbers change
Good
depending on
number.
who you talk to.
It's in
But
the billions.
yeah,
Driving change is definitely something that we've spoke about before this call, and you mentioned it again. It seems to be a top priority for you. Um, where does that come from?
um, I think perhaps because the sports provided me with such a platform, and such an opportunity to grow. Um, in a weird way, it's perhaps an opportunity for me to give back. Um, and I think back to going back to your original question about why I fell in love with sport. Um, there were moments growing up that I still remember incredibly fondly. Right, just being around people, um, learning from the diverse group that I had surrounded myself with, the friendships and bonds um, that are forged, like, on a field, in a locker room, on a bus, um, that really shape who you are, right? And my time in Southeast Asia, in many respects, created the individual who I am today. Right, my time at university and surrounding myself with the guys I played with. Um, it has a really, really strong ability to forge good in the world, and I want to be able to utilize the connections and relationships that I've built in order to grow the sport, but not just grow it for the sake of padding numbers and increasing revenues to registration fees. It's about growing it in the right way, growing it in a way that provides everyone who participates in it, a safe environment, a learning environment, an opportunity for them to develop in a similar way that I did, or at least I felt I did when I was a kid.
Amazing. Yeah, I truly love that positive change in the world, which is important. I want to go back to 2022 FIFA World Cup Qatar. Did you have any involvement, or did you just go to watch?
No, I was involved with the team. I mean, originally there, just prior to the tournament, there were a handful of meetings and conferences for most, if not all, the member associations of FIFA. And then I was embedded with the team for the duration of the time. So I stayed at the team hotel, um, left them to do the things that they needed to do, and used my opportunity there to have deep conversations with a lot of the member associations that were there. Um, I got to see the games. Obviously, I got to be involved in the tournament itself. Um, but one of the best opportunities was to be surrounded by the staff that we had sent over to help the friends and family pack, people who had traveled with the team and the players, but also the fans that had been there and made the travels to Doha too. Walking through the kind of the soccer house that we had created up the rooftop of a hotel, um, was an excellent opportunity to just walk around and talk to people about the game, the influence of the game on them, and what it was going to mean for Canada in that sort of environment. So uh, it was a really good time. It was a unique opportunity to be a part of the first World Cup in 36 years. Uh, but it was again another welcome learning opportunity that I'll be able to take and build from.
Got it. And when you say, you mentioned 36 years since Canada has been in the World Cup. So were you only helping facilitate Canadian parents be able to attend this event? Were you just focusing on Canadians, or were you also helping with other countries as well?
There were conversations with other countries about a whole slew of things. Whether it was sort of governance related, technically related, how their organizations were structured. There was an opportunity to learn from the countries that were there. Um, I think it was an opportunity for us to establish ourselves as a group that wasn't just really good at hosting events, but also an opportunity for us to be interspersed with some of the leading countries in the world and learn from them.
How many people were you working with on the
I
team?
think we had 5 or 6 of our staff that were there to facilitate um, everything that needed to happen for the friends and family of the team and their staff. We had a significant staff on the ground to manage the team, and that was all in and around John. And then we had both our president and vice president there as a representative of our board who were also doing similar things that I was doing.
Got it. Wow, this is so cool. The amount of experience that you have in the game is huge. Like, this isn't something new to you. So, for an individual that wants to one day be in your position to have these experiences, to work at FIFA, to work at CONCACAF, to work for the national team, could you kind of give us like a little bit of a blueprint in regards to steps that they need to take, qualifications that they need to meet in order to one day be in a position like you?
I don't know if I can, to be honest. I think in a similar way, and we talked about it earlier on, right, about how a player develops. It'd be the same to say to a young 10-year-old, this is what you need to do to be a pro. Um, and I think you miss all of the different opportunities that present themselves over the course of a young career or a young life. Um, there are going to be challenges and pitfalls that you hit. And it's very difficult to just map out a trajectory. And again, these paths aren't linear in any way, shape, or form. It's about taking opportunity and seizing that opportunity when you have it. But I think it's in a kind of macro way, it's about surrounding yourself with the right people, um, finding yourself or placing yourself into areas where there's growth and you're going to be challenged. And I think placing yourself or positioning yourself in places where you're constantly learning, right? Where you're constantly challenging yourself or finding that opportunity to grow as an individual. Um, and then again, not to be afraid to take some challenges or risks every once in a while, even if you think that you may not be, fully prepared for it. Um, Dive in and learn. And again, for me, it always comes back to people and relationships, and your ability to be able to navigate all of those, to be able to have conversations, to be able to learn from everyone around you. Sometimes it means listening more than talking. Um, but I think never losing sight of those opportunities when they do arise and taking them.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Having served as CEO or General Secretary at Canada Soccer, what initiatives did you champion to enhance the sports landscape in Canada during your tenure?
I mean, there's a handful of things that occurred, since I've been involved in the game here in Canada that has significantly impacted sport. But I think one of the things that I wanted to focus on specifically as the general secretary was to sort of refocus our attention and our energy back toward our people and our staff. I felt as though, and maybe COVID had a little bit to do with it, but it felt as though we were losing focus to some degree about the people that actually made up Canada Soccer. And I think many organizations go through this, right? And again, it's probably not industry specific to our sport or sport itself, where you sometimes lose sight of the fact that the people and the staff that are a part of your organization are the vital cog in what you do and what you deliver. And you can get caught up in dealing with third-party stakeholders or members or supporters, and those are all vitally important. But taking care of your people and your staff, and making sure that you're developing them as people and as managers and coaches of other people, providing them with the right tools to develop and provide feedback to the people who report to them, uh, creating a culture that fosters sort of growth and personal development. Um, and a lot of that has to do with how you retain, the talent that you've got, but it's not kind of solely focused on retention. Retention is an important aspect, but there are people who stay with organizations for 20, 30, 40 years. But they're not staying for the right reasons. I think if in some situations, if they were provided with another opportunity, they'd take it. And that's not the way you retain people, right? You retain people by making them feel engaged, making them feel as though they're a part of your organization, making sure you're retaining the right people in the right way that are fostering the right culture within your organization. That was the focus of what we wanted to do.
Hmm. You've said it a few times, working with great people, surrounding yourself with the right people. It seems like one of the keys to successful formula in regards to the works that you guys are doing. I have a behind the scene question in regards to systems. With
Yeah.
Canada Soccer, is there do you guys have like an all-in-one platform that you guys all connect to the database, like that one platform, or do you guys use multiple systems to manage the works that you guys do at Canada Soccer?
Um, One of the things that we look to do, I mean, there are multiple systems that are used. COVID sort of drove us to be able to operate remotely, right? Which sort of forced everyone into into singular platforms. I think one of the initiatives that we really didn't have prior to me taking over was a focus on, or the ability for staff to be able to seek information out relatively easy. There was no real HR structure, uh, and implementing that, allowing people a place to go if they had concerns, allowing a platform for them to go and seek out information that they were seeking just from a policy perspective, became an important piece. You know, conducting workshops and sort of classroom sessions on managers of people being able to understand how to coach, right? How to develop the people around them, um, was an important step that we had taken, and I think it was well received. Um, but you're right. I think having the opportunity to find one area where, or a singular sort of platform where people can kind of seek information, um, and use to their advantage is a vitally important piece.
COVID-19 was a hard time back 2020. Lasted for about
It
two
was.
years. Um,
I think about COVID, and we talked a little bit about running matches, in coordinating games, and as I do that. Uh, I did it both here in Canada, but also worked for FIFA and CONCACAF as a match commissioner, before, and understanding the massive amount of work, and how multifaceted running an event is. Um, Pre-COVID or post-COVID. I mean, I hate to say post-COVID because I don't think there is a post-COVID, but you know, prior to COVID was a challenge. Security, logistics, ticketing, marketing, staffing. All the things that go into running a match. Um, it's one thing to do it uh, every weekend, because you get into a sort of cadence, and it becomes sort of almost formulaic in some ways to run a match at a club. But when you do it for a national association, or a member association in a FIFA qualifier or a CONCACAF qualifier, it's a different animal. When you layer in COVID, as we had to do sort of the early part of during the run up to qualification for Qatar, um, I think back to the game in Hamilton. You probably remember, the game in Hamilton. It was, I'm guessing, because probably a week prior to the game where we were 100% certain we were going to host the game in Hamilton, just because of the COVID restrictions. We had fallback plans to whether we were going to host it in Costa Rica or Mexico or in
what?
America. We certainly didn't. Yeah, and when we first built and started planning for the game in Hamilton, we were operating on the assumption that we would have full capacity, and then we were operating off the assumption that it would be 50% capacity, um, and then it was 50% capacity but spread out over 100% of the building. And so all of those things create massive challenges around ticketing and seating and hospitality and security. And so the stress and strain on the game operations staff and the marketing staff around that event itself, was enormous. And then you layer in the fact that you've got these COVID protocols that you need to adhere to. If you can remember back, and I might get this slightly wrong, but I think it was just as the government of Canada had implemented a sort of 48-hour period where you may have to stay in quarantine, while your tests came back. The reality is that we weren't even on the ground for 48 hours, and the teams weren't on the ground for 48 hours in Canada. And so we had to work with the government of Canada, with the province of Ontario, and the stadiums itself to work through solutions. And look, they were all fantastic. It was just a stressful and very straining time to be putting on a match.
Yeah, I spoke to Bill Manning about this a bit too as well. I think you said it best in regards to laying over COVID through everything makes it 10 times harder. Just like some tomato sauce on some pasta. Not as good though.
Yeah.
Um, what key things did you take away from COVID though? During that really hard time, where was there anything that you took away that you said, "Wow, I'll live with this forever"?
Yeah. I mean, the challenges of moving, an entire team and an entire, group. And again, we're talking about, you know, 23, 25 players, same amount of staff. When you're talking about a group of 50, 60 people and the equipment that comes with, in very, very tight windows, just the logistics of that became very, very challenging. And then you layer on, the nuances of testing, um, and what it meant to not just testing a player, but making sure that they were safe and secure during the entire, 10-day, 12-day window, however long it was. But also at the same time, you know, national associations and their staff, primarily the medical staff, but also probably significant portions of the technical staff, have a deep dialogue with the players' clubs. And so coordinating all of that, the testing, letting them know how players were doing, what their plans were for getting back, navigating, the different countries and their own protocols, and making sure that you were getting people from point A to point B. Some cases it was point A to B to C to D to get them back to their club, because you had to navigate some of the COVID challenges. One of the major issues we had was we had to qualify in Haiti, right? And Haiti, a wonderful place, beautiful people, but they were going through some significant challenges with the pandemic, but also um, they had a state of emergency just because of some civil unrest. And so some of those challenges around coordinating not just the COVID reality, but the security realities on the ground were really, really testing on everybody.
Mm. What's the biggest project? What's the most amount of people that you've managed?
Um, I think within Canada Soccer, I mean, there was when I was at Toronto FC and Maple Leaf Sports, we had a significant uh, group of people within the technical side and the sporting side that I managed. Canada Soccer staff is somewhere in the range of, you know, maybe 40 to 50. And it was probably similar when we were at Toronto FC, somewhere in that range.
Mm. What advice could you give to me in regards to managing that many people?
Well, I think big picture, managing 40 and 50 people is impossible. Like, I think, you find, uh, and at Canada Soccer, it was finding, you know, a leadership team that ultimately managed, another team who then managed another team. It's important to find and surround yourself with the right group of people, the right leaders, who you trust and who trust you, and believe in the mission and the vision of what your organization is about. So I think the sweet spot is probably 4 to 5, where you manage direct reports, um, and then it branches out from there. But I've also been a firm believer of, not a very, again, you can probably tell I'm not a very linear kind of thinker. Um, I've often thought that organizations are much more spiderweb than they are, um, pyramid or kind of top down thinking. There are places all over that spiderweb where thoughts and ideas and strategies can evolve from. And anything that, like a spider web, anything that happens on one particular point, that spider web reverberates across the organization. And so you've got to think about not just the way that you build your organizations or the way you build your strategies and plans, but the way that you allow people to lead and the way that you allow people's voices to kind of rise to the top, because there are great people and great minds and great ideas right across platforms, and the key is to be able to find a way to get them to rise.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you for that, Earl. Um, you also worked at Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, including managing director and general manager position with Toronto FC. How did you contribute to the growth and success of the team during your time there?
Yeah, it was a fantastic time at Maple Leaf Sports. It was a fantastic organization led by some very, very bright people. And in many respects, how I view the development of any organization is born from some of the great thought leaders that were there. Um, the growth of Toronto FC within the sort of larger Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment family happened at a really interesting time. The the team kicked off in 2007 was our first year. Um, it was in some ways, looking back on it now, it wasn't at all. But I think in some ways at the time, many people viewed it as risky. Many people viewed it as perhaps not the decision that the organization should have been making at the time. But fortunately, the one person who absolutely didn't believe that was Richard Petty, and he was the president and CEO at the time. And he will still say, I guarantee you, if you ever had a chance to ask him, he would say today it was the best decision he ever made within the organization. Um, the at the time, I had left MLS in 2001 to come back to Canada, and I have to admit, the struggles and strains that MLS had gone through in the early part of the 2000s, I was surprised it was going to survive. And then when 2005 and 6 happened, and the thought about expanding to Canada happened, Richard had jumped all over it, and I think it set off a growth in the sport, particularly in Canada, but you know, from a wider lens in North America to where we are today. And a lot of credit needs to go to the league itself and the commissioner. And I've told him this on many occasions, that he doesn't get enough credit for what he did in those early parts of 2000 to stabilize the league and take it to where it is. A lot of people had a hand in doing it, but his steady hand on the wheel has led to kind of where we are today. It's set the pillar for the successes of the pro game, not just here in Canada, but in North America. And, I think one of the things that we did that was vitally important to the growth of the league and the sport in this country was the way that we approached the development of the team itself. It was very much a startup. And again, the people who were involved were young and energetic, and treated it just like a startup. It was exhausting work to get it to where we were in 2007 to kick it off. But one of the things that I think I'm most proud of in what we did during that period was open up what we did, and whether that was the significant work that Paul and his team had done to engage supporters and build a supporter culture organically through those groups that had already been established, turning the game itself as an entertainment property, trying to make sure that the game itself was the best 2 hours that anyone was going to spend in the city. Um, but what we did was we invited the teams, the existing teams in the league, but also the new teams that were coming. The Seattles, the Philadelphias, the Portlands, the Vancouvers, Montreals. We invited them to Toronto, and we opened everything up for them and said, over the course of 90 minutes, over the course of an entire season, we were going to compete, but we were going to compete on field. What we were going to do is share and learn from both the successes and mistakes that people make off field. And I think that is one of the biggest things that Toronto FC in the early days contributed to the growth of the sport, was that ability to share across teams and clubs and right across the league to develop the growth of the sport. And I think you see it today, right? A lot of the teams share vital information. They recognize the fact that the league is only as strong as every component within that league. And so developing the league itself, and you see it not just in Major League Soccer, but you see it in the growth of USL. You see it in the growth of NWSL, what the CPL has done here in Canada, and then ultimately what a women's league may look like in Canada too. All of those lessons, I think, are something that will help the sport dramatically.
Yeah, I'm interested to get your thoughts on the CPL, the Canadian Premier League. Started back in 2019, so it's been about 4 years, going on to 5. What are your thoughts on the CPL?
I think it's wonderful. It was, a much needed opportunity for domestic Canadians to be able to continue their growth in the game. In many respects, and people forget about this, regularly, because history seems to kind of move far faster today than it did before. But the league is only 5 years old. I think they're going into their 6th season.
Oh, 6.
And 3 of those years, 2.5, were significantly impacted by, a pandemic. And what they've managed to do and establish here, I think needs to be applauded. I think they've got significant work to do to grow, right? They need an opportunity, and I know that I'm not telling anyone anything that they don't already know, but to find the right people, the right communities, the right infrastructure, right across the country to manage that growth, but to grow it properly. And I know that the leadership there fully understands that they need to have a presence in Quebec, for example. Right, they need to be able to establish themselves in other markets. Even just the Greater Toronto area can probably house a couple of other teams. The significant work that they had done behind the scenes to involve the new group that took over from the York United franchise, the Mexican group, the work that they had done, a couple of years back to get Atletico Madrid to invest. They've been doing yeoman's work to try to build and establish the league, and it's not easy. And this, establishing a club is a challenge. Establishing a league and doing what they have done, I think it should be applauded.
Yeah, for sure. Talk about 2019. What a year to start, eh? Next year, COVID for the next 2 years, and survive that. So shout out to the CPL. Do you think Brampton could house a CPL team?
Well, you tell me.
I think we have the talent, but
yeah, I think
you got the numbers. You have the behind.
I think so. I like to call Brampton. Brampton is the new Scarborough.
Oh, okay.
When I was growing up, all of the things that Brampton is today, and the types of individuals and players that it's developing is phenomenal. And I'll have to go back and look at actual numbers, but I think the significant number of players that played on that 2022 World Cup team, that had come from Brampton is ridiculous. Like it's something like 35%, 40% um, had ties or at some point lived in Brampton, which is crazy.
Yeah, shout out to Brampton. We create some top talent over here for Canada. um,
Well, and I think maybe you could talk about this a little bit later too about where sport is going. But you know, I wouldn't be surprised if you see a cricket franchise pop up
right.
in sort of North Mississauga, Brampton at some point. Um, Whatever they're doing, and whoever's doing it is doing a fantastic job.
100%. Um, again, you've been in the game for 5 decades. Soccer, for the first decade of your career, is completely different from to where it is now. Could you share one or three significant changes to the beautiful game?
Um, I mean, I think speaking specifically here in Canada, um, I would say the professionalization of the sport um, has changed significantly. And yes, it's changed at the top end of the game, but I think you find that you have better coaches, coaches who have gone through sort of educational processes versus the coaches that I grew up playing under were basically parents, right? People who loved the sport and wanted to give back. Now I say that, my coaches were fantastic. What we did was probably different from the vast majority of clubs or organizations at the time, but I think the professionalization of the sport, um, the impact that that's had on coaching, the technical development of players themselves. You go watch a game. I go watch a university game, um, and the players are far better technically than I was growing up. And I think, do they have other things that perhaps we had growing? I don't know the answer to that. But I think the one area, and perhaps the next sort of biggest step for us, is to, while taking care and understanding that the professionalization of the game is an important trajectory to be on, um, not losing sight that the development of the game at the other end is perhaps even more important. The creation of a football culture doesn't happen at the pro end of the game. It happens at the early ages and entry level moments of the game. That's where I developed a love for the sport. That's where I developed, a keen sense of this is what I want to be and this is who I want to surround myself with for the rest of my life. And so ensuring that young players who are entering the game, and even probably prior to them entering the game, providing them with the right toolbox, the right set of technical skills and comfort with a ball to then take advantage of, that enhanced coaching. I think is a pivotal moment for us, right? The idea to recognize that 3, 4, 5, 6 year olds can foster a love of the ball, can foster a love of the game, um, and and gain some technical sense and comfort with the ball prior to them being involved in organized football and organized soccer. And I think that will do wonders for the growth of the game, the retention of players, the ability for people to want to stay involved in the game because they're far more comfortable in the environments that there are.
Got it. Yeah, grassroots key.
So,
Before
so I think that's significant. The other one that I'll mention is the shift or understanding that our sport isn't just a game that's celebrated sort of within communities. It is, but it isn't just that. That it is entertainment, right? And I think it has evolved greatly in the last 10, 15 years into an entertainment product versus just a sporting event. And I think that that's a significant shift too.
Yeah, and Canada's growing more into it. Same with the U.S. with versus a UK base where they breathe, eat, sleep it. Canada's growing every day into that, especially with the next 2 years coming up to the 2026 World Cup. I'm not going to ask you about that yet. We'll hold off that to the end as a fun question. But a quick question in regards to your new company, Kinova Solutions. Is that something that you're doing full time and you're not doing anything else, or
No, that is what I'm doing full time. Yeah.
full time? Okay.
You-
Yeah. Okay. So, as the CEO and founder of Kinova Solutions, what inspired you to establish the company, and how do you integrate your passion for sports and entertainment in its mission and operations?
You know, I think what I've created and what I want to do to impact sport um, is a culmination of everything we've sort of discussed, right? It's the goal, and the ultimate goal is to make, I was going to say make the sport better, but make world better through sport, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And by that I mean, the organizations themselves, the clubs, the federations, all of it. There are significant aspects of sport today, and I suppose society in general, that in some ways feel broken, or feel disconnected, in some ways from how cultures are evolving and growing today. Um, in many respects, they seem like remnants of you know time past. A lot of organizations are and it makes them a significant part of the community, but a lot of them are built off of 100-year-old premises, or structures that don't particularly work very well or aren't congruent with society today. Um, whether that is governance structures that are broken, or don't provide access, or don't provide the right protections, um, or voices to be heard within their organizations. Um, in some cases, and in some realms, there's a toxicity today that occurs. And again, I'm not talking about something that's specific to sport. It's societal in many ways, that I think needs fixing, or at least needs attention. I think that there's a tendency today that who can yell the loudest, or perhaps even the fastest, tends to be the one that seems to be telling the truth. Um, and that mentality again is societal, right? And my focus is to get us back to a point where we are listening to each other. We are having conversations with people, um, building opportunities for us to learn from lessons of the past and develop new systems and new structures. And I'll use one sort of example. Um, you know, this kind of speaks to the toxicity of society today in some ways. But during the course of the last year and a half, I've had an opportunity to have deep conversations with some people who aren't in sports specifically, but in global affairs communities, and have worked in other areas around the world. And they also love our sport. They also love football, and see a hatred, or a racist sort of toxicity building within the sport, and want to find ways to solve and fix those things. So I've been working with a handful of people who are incredibly bright, incredibly passionate about what they do, about solving some of those issues. And I think, just recently, FIFA and FIFPro released some of the information stemming from the Women's World Cup and some of the online abuse and hatred and racism that stemmed um, from that tournament. And I think that both of those organizations have done fantastic jobs in identifying the problem, in some ways shielding um, the players and the associations themselves from some of that vitriol that ends up online. But to me, it's masking a problem that is ever present and growing. Right? It's masking an issue that needs to be tackled and handled, and handled in such a way that isn't like we've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years. We've been trying, and rightly so, regulating it and policing it and making sure that the people who are doing these things are punished. But we're not really dealing with the core issues and tackling, the origins of the problem. And I think that's what I'm working on with this group, who have been significant players in different areas around the world in some very, very serious things. And the hope is that we start to be able to build and change what has been learned, in some ways unlearning past behaviors, to understand the impact and influence it has on people. And so it is one of those things that I'm vastly passionate about and will continue to do, regardless of where Kinova takes me. It is one of those things that I believe needs to be fixed, and needs to be fixed, at least addressed urgently.
Yeah, Earl, I really admire the work that you do, and I appreciate all the works that you've done in the beautiful game. It really inspires me. You're someone I want to learn from, and hopefully you could advise me along my journey. With saying that, to end off on a fun question, we're seeing the Messi effect down in U.S. Miami, Florida. We got
Yeah.
2 years before the 2026 World Cup. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts on Messi?
Everything. I mean, you had a little smile when I mentioned Messi. You had a little smile with the World Cup. Canada, Mexico, U.S. are hosting. So just overall
Yeah.
level, just big picture.
I think it was, I listened to, I think it was maybe when you interviewed Kyle Sheldon,
Yeah,
a little while ago, and he had mentioned, the runway in North America over the next kind of 4, 5, 6 years, right? And it's crazy. You've got, Copa America next year. You've got a brand new Women's Gold Cup, happening at the same time, or in and around the same time. You've got a Club World Cup happening, an expanded version of the Club World Cup, which is going on right now in Saudi. The World Cup itself in 26, the potential of a Women's World Cup in 27 in North America, and then the Olympics in 28. Just a crazy opportunity for our sport to evolve and develop in a very, very tight window, with the eyes of the world focused on us. The move from Europe to North America for Messi. You've seen the reverberations of the move itself, right, within our sporting landscape, and it's been significant. I think that there is a globalization of I'll say our sport, but multiple sports. Cricket is one of them. The globalization of a sport like F1 that had sort of traditional bases in maybe Europe, and you see a shift ever so slightly from the traditional power bases of where sport has kind of lived and breathed, and you see it in professional fighting, golf, tennis, within our sport itself, and the shifts around the world, the influence of Asia, the influence of the Arab world, the influence of North America on all of those sports. I think is going to have a significant impact on our sport specifically in the next, 4 or 5 years here in North America. I think that it was telling that, the expansion of the World Cup to 48 teams was going to happen in North America. I think we will see a World Cup like none other here, not just from a revenue perspective, but from a fan engagement perspective. There's a significant opportunity for our sport to grow in a way that probably the last opportunity we had was going back to '94, right? And the significant impact that the World Cup had on the development of the game in North America then. I think this will be 10, 20-fold.
I'm excited. I can't believe I'm alive for this. Super excited to see this through. Super excited to see this through.
Yeah, and sorry, I don't know what it's going to look like in the next 5 or 6 years. I'm excited like you are, right? I think that there's this opportunity to engage whole generations of and a new generation to the sport. I think back to some of the fantastic work that the NFL did on I think it was in September. They had a game in London. I'm going to get the teams wrong, probably Atlanta, maybe Jacksonville. They played a game in London, and because of the timing of the game, it was being broadcast here. They had created a collaboration with Disney and Pixar, and Toy Story'd the game like it was an animated game, and I think that ingenuity and creativity around how you engage younger generations and make them or different generations and make them fans of your sport is something that we will start to see bleed into the more traditional sort of traditional sports around the world that are sort of relatively nuanced in the US and Canada. I think the ability for fans to now get a peek behind the curtain in some ways and understand what happens behind the scenes in sport is one of those things that I think you'll see more and more, which will then create a new affinity for the sports like ours, like cricket, like rugby, around the world.
Yeah, I agree, especially with the digitalization and all this content. Yeah. Earl, this was a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for taking the time for joining us on the One Soccer Nation podcast today.
Always my pleasure. Anytime.